Now that you know how to run the architecture development method cycle like an enterprise architect, you need to start where real success is decided: the preliminary phase. This phase is not about drawing target states or producing architecture artifacts. It is about setting the rules of the game before the game begins. If you skip or rush this phase, you can still produce impressive architecture, but it will not stick because the organization will not have the decision rights, principles, and capability to execute it consistently. When you do the preliminary phase well, you create an environment where architecture becomes a trusted operating discipline that guides change, controls risk, and supports delivery speed. Building on why this phase matters, you should view the preliminary phase as your enterprise architecture foundation. It defines what enterprise architecture means in your organization, how it will be governed, and how it will be used to make decisions. It clarifies who owns architecture direction, who must comply, how exceptions work, and how architecture aligns to strategy and delivery. The preliminary phase also helps you avoid a common leadership trap, assuming that having a method automatically creates influence. Influence comes from agreed principles, clear scope, and an operating capability that people trust. The preliminary phase is where you earn that trust by establishing clarity and fairness before people start building. With that leadership purpose in mind, your first major task is setting scope. Scope is not just a boundary on a diagram. It is a decision about what you are accountable for and what you can realistically govern. You define what part of the enterprise the architecture effort covers, such as a whole organization, a business unit, a shared platform, or a cross-agency ecosystem. You also define what types of decisions architecture will influence, such as platform standards, integration patterns, data ownership, security requirements, and operational readiness. When scope is too wide, architecture becomes abstract and slow. When scope is too narrow, architecture becomes local optimization and fails to protect enterprise outcomes. Your job is to set scope at the level where decisions can be made, enforced, and measured. Now that scope is set, you need principles because principles are the simplest tool for consistent decision making at scale. Principles are not slogans, they are rules that guide choices when trade-offs appear. A strong principle tells teams what matters most and what must be protected, even under delivery pressure. For example, you might set principles such as security by design, reuse before building new platforms, data is owned and managed deliberately, and operational readiness is a release requirement. Principles work when they are few, clear, and consistently enforced. They fail when they are too many, too vague, or not tied to governance. In the preliminary phase, you create principles that act like North Stars for every architecture conversation that follows. With principles established, you need to translate them into standards and guardrails so teams can execute without guessing. A principle like security by design becomes guardrails, such as identity and access requirements, logging expectations, data handling rules, and baseline resilience expectations. A principle like reuse before building becomes guardrails, such as approved shared services and platform choices. The key leadership move is keeping guardrails focused on high-impact risks and enterprise-wide consistency. When guardrails try to control everything, teams resist and bypass. When guardrails focus on the few things that prevent chaos, teams adopt because it reduces uncertainty and rework. This is how you control risk and cost while still enabling teams to deliver quickly. Now that you have guardrails, you need decision rights because unclear authority is one of the biggest causes of slow delivery. Decision rights define which decisions are local to teams and which require enterprise alignment. For example, teams might decide user interface choices, but enterprise architecture might govern identity and access, integration patterns, data ownership, and platform selection. Clear decision rights prevent two damaging extremes: over centralization, where every decision becomes a bottleneck, and uncontrolled decentralization, where every team invents its own standards. In the preliminary phase, you design decision rights so teams have autonomy where it is safe, and the enterprise has control where it must protect shared outcomes. With decision rights clear, governance becomes easier to design in a way people trust. Governance should not feel like surprise approvals or late audits. It should feel predictable, fast, and risk based. You establish how architecture reviews work, what triggers deeper review, what evidence is required, and how decisions are recorded. You also establish how exceptions are requested and approved, so teams do not feel trapped when constraints exist. Predictable governance increases speed because teams engage earlier and avoid late redesign. Fair governance increases adoption because teams feel the rules apply consistently. In the preliminary phase, you shape governance as an enabling system that protects the enterprise without punishing delivery. Now that governance is defined, you need the architecture capability that makes governance real. Capability is not a role title. It is the combination of people, process, tools, and authority required to run architecture as a continuous discipline. You clarify who performs architecture work, how architects collaborate with product and platform teams, how architecture content is managed, and how decisions flow into delivery. You also clarify escalation paths, so unresolved trade-offs do not stall programs. Tools matter too, but only in support of the operating model, because a repository does not create capability on its own. In the preliminary phase, you are essentially building the architecture engine room that keeps the organization aligned through change. With capability in mind, your next leadership task is role clarity, because ambiguity creates conflict. You clarify what enterprise architects own, what domain architects own, what solution architects own, and what delivery leaders own. Enterprise architects typically own enterprise direction, principles, and cross-cutting standards. Domain architects focus on specific areas such as data, security, or platforms. Solution architects focus on individual solutions within the guardrails. Delivery leaders own execution, timelines, and team outcomes. This clarity reduces politics because architecture becomes an operating model rather than a personal influence contest. When roles are clear, accountability becomes visible, and the organization can move faster with fewer disagreements. Now that responsibilities are clearer, you need a place where architecture decisions and key content can live and stay discoverable. The repository should not become a dumping ground for diagrams. It should act as decision memory where people can find principles, standards, approved patterns, key target direction, and the reasoning behind major choices. This matters because repeated debate is expensive. When the reasoning is visible, teams stop relitigating the same choices and start executing. A decision-focused repository also supports governance and audits because it provides traceability from strategy to decisions to delivery outcomes. In the preliminary phase, you set the expectation that content exists to enable action and accountability, not to satisfy documentation habits. With your architecture capability taking shape, you need to connect it to the places where the enterprise actually decides what gets done. Strategy and portfolio investment. Architecture must influence prioritization, sequencing, and funding choices. Otherwise, it becomes advisory and optional. You establish how architecture engages with portfolio planning, how roadmaps are reviewed, and how major initiatives align to target direction and principles. This alignment makes architecture a business discipline because it shapes what is funded and why. It also controls cost because it reduces duplication, prevents unplanned platform sprawl, and promotes reuse. In the preliminary phase, You are positioning architecture as part of enterprise decision making, not as an afterthought that appears once delivery is already underway. Now that strategy and portfolio alignment is in place, you can focus on risk because surprises are what destroy trust. You define how risks are identified, recorded, and managed, especially in areas such as security, compliance, resilience, vendor dependency, and operational readiness. You also clarify how risk acceptance works, who can accept risk, and what evidence is required to make that acceptance accountable. When risk is visible early, leaders can make informed trade-offs and delivery teams can design with confidence. When risk is hidden, it emerges late as incidents, delays, and cost blowouts. The preliminary phase is where you set the expectation that risk is not a hidden tax. It is a managed decision. With the pieces coming together, imagine you are preparing the organization for a cloud and security program across multiple business units. You start by defining scope, such as shared platforms, identity and access, network patterns, logging standards, and operational requirements. You establish principles such as secure by design and consistent monitoring. You translate those into guardrails such as baseline identity and access requirements, logging expectations, and approved platform patterns. You define decision rights so teams can move quickly in local choices but must align on shared foundations. You set predictable governance and a respectful exception process so delivery remains fast. You clarify roles across enterprise architecture, security architecture, platform teams, and solution teams. You create a decision-focused repository so patterns and decisions are reused. The outcome is that when the program starts, teams are not debating fundamentals, they are executing within a known system. Now that you have a clear picture of success, you should watch for common failures that undermine architecture. One failure is skipping principles and relying on informal influence, which collapses when pressure rises. Another failure is defining scope too broadly and losing practical traction. Another failure is over-governing, which triggers bypass behavior and resentment. Another failure is creating roles without decision rights, which produces meetings without authority. Another failure is building a repository full of artifacts but no clear standards or approved patterns. You avoid these failures by staying outcome driven. You set only the principles and guardrails that change behavior. You design governance that is risk based and fast, and you establish decision rights that remove uncertainty. With failure patterns understood, you need success signals that prove the preliminary phase delivered value. You know it worked when teams engage earlier because governance is predictable and helpful. You know it worked when decisions are made faster because decision rights are clear. You know it worked when standards are reused because patterns and guardrails are easy to find and easy to adapt. You know it worked when exceptions are transparent and time-bound rather than hidden and permanent. You know it worked when leaders can defend decisions because principles and risk acceptance are documented. These signals show that architecture is not just producing content, it is changing how the organization makes decisions and manages change. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can apply it immediately. You learned that the preliminary phase is where you set the conditions that determine whether enterprise architecture will succeed or fail in real delivery. You learned that your first leadership move is defining enterprise scope so architecture is neither too broad to execute nor too narrow to protect enterprise outcomes. You learned how to create practical architecture principles and translate them into standards and guardrails that enable speed while controlling risk. You learned that decision rights are essential for fast delivery because they clarify what teams can decide locally and what requires enterprise alignment. You learned how to design governance that is predictable, risk-based, and fair, supported by a respectful exception process. You learned that architecture capability is a real operating model made of people, processes, tools, and authority, not just a method. Finally, you learned how to connect architecture to strategy, portfolio decisions, and risk management. So, architecture becomes a trusted enterprise decision system. Now that you understand how the preliminary phase sets up principles, scope, and architecture capability in TOGAF 10, you are ready to make architecture practical before delivery pressure hits. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with your architecture and delivery peers, and comment with the one principle or guardrail you believe your organization should adopt first to reduce risk and speed up delivery.